Well, it's 4 o'clock in Radio Cairo and time for World of Info. Well, it's Radio Cairo. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. This is World of Info. Dua Muhammad is at the control. Our telephone number is 257-89407, coming live from Studio 3, and we have a great pleasure and great honor to have such a distinguished diplomat who's serving here in Egypt, almost now for 2 years, His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, the Ambassador of Republic of Ireland here in Cairo, and definitely it's going to be a very fruitful afternoon. His Excellency has come here before to our program 2 years back, and he is coming here again, or last year, but he's coming here again to tell us about his great and grand activities in Egypt. His Excellency has served as a diplomat for his country in Finland, in Turkey, in China, in Brussels, in Slovenia as an ambassador, and now he's the current resident ambassador in Egypt and the non-resident ambassador in Lebanon and Syria, and we have a lot to talk to him with such an experienced Renaissance man, as we have to call him, because he has a degree in microbiology, but a degree also in business administration, and a master's in the conflict studies and reconciliation, and a master's in public policy. The real experienced diplomat, His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon. Thank you very much for coming, sir, and sparing and giving us time in your busy schedule to be here as a distinguished guest in Radio Cairo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mabrouk. It's a pleasure to be back with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Well, it's definitely reviving. We'll just give our... last time we have talked much about Ireland as a republic, about Ireland as a dear, friendly country with Egypt, a country that has been always going along with Egypt in its heydays and in historical relations. We are today going to cover most of our Egyptian-Irish relations that go back into at least 100 years from the period of independence of both our countries. But we are going to present our listeners part of the history of Ireland, because Ireland is a beautiful country with 4.8 million inhabitants, yet it has influenced the world through its culture or through the influence of the immigrants. We have to ask you this question, which is the same question we asked you as an introductory question last time in our interview, sir.
Sure. No, I mean, it's true. For various reasons, we have had a large diaspora, and this is partly to do with our history, very much to do with history, and particularly the Great Famine in Ireland between 1845 and 1847. This established a pattern of emigration out of Ireland. But we had been emigrating for long before that. There were many Irish people involved in the establishment of the United States, and we had many people transported as criminals to Australia. We had many people who left Ireland to find their way in Latin America. We also have a grand missionary tradition of priests and nuns leaving Ireland. This is a tradition that goes back nearly 2,000 years, but leaving Ireland and going out into the world. Rumours have it
is that the Egyptian monks were the first one who gave Christianity to Ireland.
Well, this is a theory this is a theory which has some evidence. Yes. But what this means is that you find Irish people everywhere in the world. We say that there are maybe 70 million people of Irish heritage around the world. The vast majority of them would be in the United States. I think we've provided around about 22 of the US presidents have got some Irish heritage,
yes,
which is quite remarkable. That's half the US
and you had in the history a typical Irish president, even in part of the religion, as the only Catholic president of Irish descendancy, and that of course was John Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy was, of course, yes, was of Irish descent.
Who visited Ireland during his tenure and paid tribute to his ancestors in Ireland, and in a very memorable visit to Dublin back in the early 60s as a president, not as a senator, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right. And indeed, that the relationship with the Kennedy family has continued right up until the present day. I just saw last week in the newspaper that one of John F. Kennedy's, I guess, grandnieces is going to be in his ancestral home place for the launch of some local event. So they maintain the link even now.
And this is what I find very interesting, because during your talk about the immigrants who left Ireland, we forgot one of the biggest populations in diaspora, which is in the British Isles, right?
Well, of course, and that's something we often forget, even in Ireland, is that the links between Britain and Ireland are so strong and have been strong for a very, very long time. I think one of the figures I've seen is that about a quarter of people in the United Kingdom, outside Northern Ireland, can claim some Irish ancestry, and in fact we're seeing that at the moment with a lot of people asserting their right to an Irish passport.
Really, especially with this Brexit,
because of Brexit,
problem.
Yes,
so they're coming and linking themselves with Ireland, wanting their passports. They're bringing with them birth certificates of their ancestors, or what?
Precisely.
That's very interesting.
Although it's not unlimited in Ireland, we limit it to a you have to have a grandparent who was born on the island of Ireland to claim Irish citizenship. So, but we've seen a huge increase in the number of people wanting to do that. Of course, to maintain their freedom of movement within the European Union.
So it was the secret of the human being, the Irish human being, who had the adventure, who had the country that was a bit ejecting people or forcing them to immigrate because of the harsh weather conditions or the harsh famine that happened. But there is and there has been and there is always the Irish pride and the Irish power of the fact that we are different. We are not as British as you may think. Yes, we respect Britain. We consider it to be an older brother, maybe, or a senior friend, but we are having our own identity. And I think we have to relate that to the struggle for independence, because Britain considered Ireland to be part of its domain, and at that time Britain was having an empire, and this empire included, besides of course countries like our country Egypt, or a huge subcontinent like India, and which include India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, the current of today, and Sri Lanka and all these places. Yet also they were considering the whole island of Ireland to be theirs as well.
Sure.
So what happened? What pushed the people to say, no, we are different, we are not British, we are thinking of you as occupiers, and we want you to leave? What made the Irish make this decision, sir?
Well, I think you have to look at the long history between Britain and Ireland. Of course, we're neighbours. I mean, by geography, we can't avoid that. And if you go back into deep history, of course, there has always been migration between the two countries, and there has always been a strong link. But Ireland always maintains this separate identity. Of course, we had and have our own language, and after the Reformation, Ireland remained Catholic, whereas England particularly became Protestant.
But some of the northern Irish population became with the English, with the Church of England, or Protestants.
Well, the Northern Ireland population is predominantly Protestant at the moment, but the reason for that is because of a transplantation of population from Scotland and England after what the English called the Glorious Revolution in 1690, when William of Orange came to the throne in England and defeated his father-in-law, James, and the second, that defeat meant that many of the king's supporters in Ireland were displaced from the land and replaced by soldiers loyal to the new king, and that was a transplantation. But in fact, that is part of the source of the conflicts in Northern Ireland. But this long history and long and complex history, really, it was after the potato famine. In between 1845 and 1847, you did have this increasing sense of nationalism. Alongside that increasing sense of nationalism, you had right through Europe. It followed the same pattern, and small nations wishing to assert themselves as independent and sovereign. As the 19th century progressed, you also had a nationalist revival movement happening in Ireland, so a cultural nationalist revival movement, based very much around the language, but not only, also ancient stories, and this eventually led to clamour and call for Ireland to return to have its own parliament. It had its own parliament until 1801, when the two parliaments were united, the British and Irish parliaments were united. And there was a sense that Ireland was being left behind economically, and that the mistakes of the famine would not have happened if we had had our own parliament. So there was increasing nationalism and increasing call for a return of autonomy originally. And then the British Parliament passed an act granting home rule to Ireland, and that was delayed by the First World War, leading to an armed revolt in 1916. And from then, we developed we came to develop that increasing sense of the need for a separate nation, which led to the start of our War of Independence
and this was in
1920.
1920, yes. And from 1920 to 1923, there was a civil war.
Well, we had the Independence War, and then after the Independence War, we had a civil war.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this period is, by the way, going hand in hand with the same period that we have known in Egypt.
Sure.
Because after World War II, World War I, there was a lot of hopes and a lot of despair.
Yes.
So after the break, we'll talk about that. Okay. So we're still coming live from Studio 3 with World of Info with His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, the Ambassador of Ireland in Cairo, and definitely we have a good talk about history in the beginning before going to the current affairs. And of course we have just stopped with our listeners into 1918 and 1919, which is the dawn of hope and despair. Because in 1919 there was the famous conference that Woodrow Wilson said that he is going to make this in order to help all the lonely hearts, or the lonely hearts of the countries. And it was very romantic. Everybody thought that all the countries that are occupied by the imperial forces at the time, whether this was France or Britain, will have a chance, and they will become independent, and the imperialism is going to end, and there will be a new dawn in the foreign relations. And of course there was despair. In Egypt we had Saad Zaghloul, and the whole country and the whole nation went behind him in order to ask for a seat for Egypt in this conference, and asking for the self-right to govern and for independence. At the same time, Ireland was having the same struggle, and Ireland found that unfortunately, with the failure of the romanticism of Woodrow Wilson and his giving in for his allies of the war, and accepting all their imperial desires, they decided to fight their way. We decided apart civil defense. We were totally lacking any weapons, but the Irish took part in World War I. You had a decent armed population, or army, or self-governing units, or army units, who were able to start a struggle. Tell us about this period, sir.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned 1919. We, in my ministry, date the foundation of our ministry to the sending of the Irish delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, and we say that's when Irish diplomacy started. But yeah, from 1916 to 1920, of course, there were small groups of guerrillas were training, were arming, and certainly were receiving assistance in their being armed from the United States. And the War of Independence started effectively with the shooting of a policeman. And from then on, it developed into a real war between the British Army and the the Irish guerrillas. And ultimately, although it's a very romanticised version of events, you may remember the Michael Collins film. Ultimately, the British government decided that the only way to end the war in Ireland was to negotiate with the guerrillas, and that led to a treaty between Britain and Ireland for British withdrawal from 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland, and the establishment of the Irish Free State. And the Irish Free State grew into the Ireland of today. But that treaty was not accepted by the whole population, and although it was voted in favour by the Irish Parliament, it was a large portion of the Parliament rejected it, and we then had a civil war, a very tragic civil war. All civil war is tragic, with brothers killing brothers.
Brothers are fighting, yes.
But that ended in 1923, and we went on to develop our state and our statehood, and the population accepted the peace, and we began to grow as a state. And the party which had initiated the Civil War in 1923 came to power in 1932, and then 1937 we had a new constitution which ended the Irish Free State and established Ireland as a sovereign republic.
So Ireland started its advance towards progress, economic progress, and in the middle, of course, in this saga, there was World War II, and Ireland was successful, strange enough, to stay on the neutral side. Although the neutral, we have to put quote unquote, that there were a lot of Irish people, Irish men and women, who were involved in fighting on the side of democracy with the British and with the Allies. They didn't choose to fight against Britain, but they fought on the same side for the sake of democracy and for the sake of neighborhood. What made all this group of people enroll in the army? What do you think the main motive was?
I think there were multiple motivations, and you're right. Ireland remained militarily neutral during the Second World War, and I think that was a decision of the government of the time, which I think was motivated very much by the very recent experience of conflict in Ireland and the possibility that our involvement in the Second World War might reopen that conflict. But at the same time, we were neutral militarily, but we were neutral on the side of democracy. And so you did have not only very large numbers of Irish people going to fight for the Allies, you also had a lot of, as it's been discovered now, a lot of actual cooperation between the Irish authorities and the Allied authorities. For example, before D-Day in 1944, the Irish weather forecasters were sharing their information about the weather that was advancing across Europe, because, of course, we're closest to the Atlantic. So there was a lot of cooperation. And the other thing that is remarkable in a way is that we probably breached the rules of neutrality by the international law of neutrality when Allied airmen or Allied sailors were stranded in Ireland because of ships sinking or aircraft crashing. We allowed them to return through Northern Ireland to Britain, whereas the Germans were all interned.
They were put in a prisoner of war camp?
The Germans were put in a prisoner of war camp, yes. Yeah. So, well, not a prisoner of war camp because we weren't at war, but they were interned,
That's very interesting, and I think going on the side of neutrality also paid. And then there was, of course, the after World War II. After World War II, there was a recession. There was another wave of immigration.
Yes.
Could you explain that? I mean, people should have now said that the country is going to get a better condition. Now there is another wave of immigrants.
I think history would tell us that the economic management of Ireland was not best, and that led to a very radical change in the way we looked at economics in 1958 and industrial development. We established the Industrial Development Authority, which was intended to attract investment to Ireland. and we also changed our trade policy. We went from being protectionist to being a very open economy. And that's a policy which we've continued right up until the present day. And it's meant that we are now one of the most open economies in the world, and we are one of the largest international traders relative to the size of our population.
And this allowed the improvement of the economics. So from starting in 1980s onwards until the start of the new millennium, we found that Ireland was having a booming economy. And it was in 2008, there was the international recession that started in the US, and suddenly things were not getting better in Ireland, and there was a recession also in Ireland. But lately, I mean, 2 years ago, there was a start of resurrection. So how could you explain the recession? How could you explain that the way that you were fighting this recession?
Well, Ireland was very much exposed to international finance in 2008. Was one of the risks of being a large open economy, and we were very, very seriously affected. Irish banks were very, very largely exposed to the international crisis. We entered into an IMF program, and we had a bailout from the European Union and some other countries to help our banks. And we always said that the fundamentals of the Irish economy were good. The real problem was a banking crisis more than an economic crisis. And once we resolved the banking crisis, we knew that the economy would take off again.
It would straighten itself again.
So that's what's happened, and we're the fastest. I think maybe not quite the fastest, but certainly the second fastest growing economy in Europe at the moment. I think Hungary might be a little bit ahead of us, and we continue to attract high levels of international investment. And we continue to be a major exporter and trader around the world. We are the largest exporter of skim milk powder in the Northern Hemisphere. We're the largest exporter of beef in the Northern Hemisphere. Agriculture remains very, very important to the Irish economy. But also we benefit from the investment from largely American companies, made on the internet companies. So the European headquarters of LinkedIn, of Google, of Facebook are all based in Dublin. And so this is good for our tax revenues. It's good for employment, and it's good for our exports as well.
So before we leave and talk about Egyptian-Irish relations, we have to raise another subject which always attracting the attention of a lot of people. Yeah. Ireland has the highest percentage of Nobel prizes in literature in comparison to the population. Sure. So we find George Bernard Shaw, William Butler, Yeats, and Samuel Beckett, and Seamus Heaney, although not a Nobel Prize winner, but he was also famous. So why? How come that Nobel laureates in literature, in particular, are that common in such a small population?
It's a very good question, and I don't know that anybody has a very easy answer to it.
Yes.
But we have a long tradition of storytelling, and storytelling is something that's very, very important in Ireland. But I think as well, when you have this blend of languages, so Irish, the Irish language, Gaeilge, and English, you come up with more imaginative, more creative uses of language, and I think that's something that's very, very attractive in particularly poetry, but not just. And I think we have a quite unique Hiberno English dialect, which is derived very much from the Irish language, and I think that's something that people find interesting. So I think
there are a lot of stories to be told. Right?
Lots of stories to be told. Lots of stories to be told. Yes,
so after the break, with His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, the Ambassador of Ireland in Cairo, we'll talk about Egyptian-Irish relations and how they're faring, and I believe they're faring very well.
Thank you.
Stay with us, please. So we're still listening to Radio Cairo, World of Info, with His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, the Ambassador of Ireland in Cairo, and we're talking about Egyptian-Irish relations, because this is very special relations. We have the same background, we have the same type of struggle that we did in our aim and in our path for independence. You were a bit lucky, we were not, but we, in the end, we have the same background. And I don't want to say the same enemy, but I would like to say the same foe, the same person, or the same people who were occupying us were occupying you, and so we are sharing in a lot of things, and we've been also impressed and being influenced by the British, like you have been also impressed and influenced by them. We fought on their sides in World War I and World War II, although that was never given a proper mention, as we were discussing off air, how in Gallipoli the number of Irish casualties were high, and I told you back the number of casualties, the Egyptian casualties in Gallipoli were also very high. The number of casualties on the Western Front from the Irish side and from the Egyptian sides was also very high in World War I. In World War II, Egypt was one of the most important secondary theaters of war in World War II. So there is a lot in common between us, and there is a strong relations, and I believe since our independence we have had diplomatic relations. How many years you're celebrating now the official diplomatic relations between Egypt and Ireland?
Well, we opened the embassy here in 1976, but I believe we had diplomatic relations before that, going back to the 1960s. But I don't want to dwell too much on the history, but I think that there are some remarkable links between Egypt and Ireland. One of the most fascinating for me was the case of an Egyptian medical student who was studying in Dublin and was observing the new Irish state, and he wrote a book where he urged the Egyptian nationalists to follow the Irish path. And I think this is very interesting. And of course, we've had this long history of Egyptian medical students studying in Ireland, and we're keen to continue those links in education.
Speaking about that, we have to give a mention to my late father, when after the war of 1956, as an officer and in the medical corps as a physician. He had a scholarship to travel to the UK, but it was turned to Ireland because we didn't have any relations. And so my father had his first part of his FRCS from Dublin.
Right. And
my mother had her master's degree in Trinity College in Dublin. And these were very colorful, bright 2 years, yes, from 57 to 59. So we're talking about, though there was no actual diplomatic relations at that time, but my father and my mother were very more than welcome at that time, yes, and they were fully integrated in the country in Dublin, and they felt very much at home.
Yes.
We have a lot of common features between the Irish and the Egyptians, right? As hospitality, right?
We do indeed. And I think the people to people contacts, the people to people links are very, very important, and we're very, very happy in that relationship, and I keep meeting here in Egypt people whose parents or uncles, aunts studied in Dublin, and in a whole range of fields, but particularly the sciences and medicine. And of course, we have a small Irish community here of particularly Irish women who have come here.
Who married to these students.
Who are married to Egyptian men.
Yes.
And that's something that is very, very important in those people's lives.
I met a lot of few people like this, and I really find it very interesting because when I met 2 or 3 ladies or 2 or 3 gentlemen who are mixed Irish, Egyptian Irish, I really just said the looks are foreign, but they are totally Egyptianized.
Yes.
And even their parents, whether this was a father, an Irish father, or an Irish mother, the relation went on and continued and flourished.
Yes.
And they have several kids, and the ladies or the men lived here happily after, considering themselves really living at home. They didn't have this homesickness that sometimes people from the north have here in a warm country like Egypt, right?
Sure. No, but the same goes in the opposite direction. I mean, there are Egyptian men mostly married to Irish women in Ireland who are well settled, and they are, as we say in Ireland, more Irish than the Irish themselves.
Yes.
And
a friend of mine who's now the current ambassador in Ireland, Ambassador Khalid Gaudat, who was a class fellow of mine, he's always keep on posting on photographs of Irish Egyptian families living there, or Egyptian immigrants who are living in Ireland and fully integrated, especially in the technocrat fields, right?
Absolutely, we've got a lot of Egyptian engineers and physicians, but also people with business degrees working in Ireland. I mean, one of the features of as I mentioned earlier, the companies like Facebook and Google is that they are very international, and they bring in talent from around the world. And again, I keep meeting people here who have worked for Google or Facebook and are now back in Egypt, or who are going to work in Dublin. But I should say as well, I mean, the people to people is important, but we're remarkably close politically as well. I mean, we share in foreign policy. We share a lot of things very, very much in common. Ireland has long been committed to the Palestinian cause, and perhaps because of our own independence struggle, and perhaps because of our own experiences, we feel very close to the Palestinians.
Do you have any Palestinian immigrants living now in Ireland?
Yes, we have indeed. Quite. I would say quite a lot. But as well as that, on things like disarmament, we're very, very close. Ireland is seeking a seat on the UN Security Council. We're hoping to be elected in July this year, or whenever the election is. It's not entirely clear, but for the period from January 2021 for 2 years, and we are hopeful that because of our closeness in policy terms to Egypt, that Egypt will vote for us.
Of course,
of
course.
But I mean, but also we shouldn't neglect either the business relations, because the business relations between Ireland and Egypt are good.
Tell us about that, sir, because I know that you've been working on this field very actively.
Yeah, this is probably the most important part of my diplomatic mission here, is to re-establish the business links. Ireland is a major, as I said earlier, agricultural exporter. We are already exporting milk and cheese to Egypt in reasonably large quantities. Egypt is exporting to us fruits and vegetables, and one of the key things for us in developing that relationship is something I've been working on with Ambassador Thawat and his predecessor, and also with Dublin Airport and with Egypt Air, is the development of a direct flight between Cairo and Dublin. And I'm very, very happy to say that we will have an Egyptian airline flying into Dublin from the 2nd of June, 4 times a week. And this will enhance the business relationship. It makes it much easier to export in both directions.
You're expecting a full house on these flights, hopefully?
Well, hopefully. I mean, there is that phrase, "Build it and they will come." I hope the establishment of the flights, which I'm assuming is being done on sound commercial basis, that the companies involved feel that the traffic is there, will also attract more business. It should ensure that we get more Irish tourists coming to Egypt.
How many Irish tourists? I mean, not in real figures, but there are some people coming.
There are some people coming. We don't count the figures in that way, so I can't say exactly. Of course, we did have a fall in the numbers of people coming after the revolution, but Egypt used to be a very, very popular destination for Irish holidaymakers. You know, in the cold north, it's always nice to come to the warm sun in the wintertime.
Yes. Especially with the presence of a direct flight, I think things will get much easier.
Yes. And I hope also we'll have some Egyptian tourists going to Ireland, because like I say, those people-to-people links are very important, and the more we have traffic going in each direction, the better we understand each other, and the better it is for everything, but business particularly.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Because I believe there is a lot of things to go with business as well. Yeah. You spoke about the cheese industry and the milk industry and the fruits and vegetables that are. How about the high-tech cooperation?
Well, this is another area where Ireland excels, and we find now that we are continuing to expand our tech sector. We have a very, very good tech startup environment in Ireland. But one of the challenges for us is finding talent to fill the jobs that are there. So I think the future for us in that respect is partnering with partners from around the world where there are possibilities to develop technology together. Egypt is one of those places which I think offers a lot of potential for us. We are already in software cooperating very, very closely with a number of Egyptian companies, while Irish companies are cooperating with Egyptian companies. And I see the possibility for that to increase. Pharmaceuticals, medical devices, similarly. I mean, we have some remarkable medical devices startup companies, particularly in the area of stents and for cardiac operations, cardiac conditions, but also in the area of joints and artificial joints and things like this. So when you have a very large population like Egypt, which has a need for these devices, it's also an opportunity to develop those devices because with our only 5 million people, we don't have the same number of people where we can test these devices and such. I'm not talking in a very controlled clinical trials. Yes.
So when we're talking about that also as well, we have to give a mention to education.
Yes.
President Sisi has been very much interested and enthusiastic about cooperation between first world countries in education, and trying to import strong educational systems or international prominent successful educational universities to take part here in Egypt. And as I know through my mother that about education, for example, she had this master's degree in Trinity College in Dublin, which is one of the oldest colleges in the world and very prestigious and sophisticated. How much is the plan for any cooperation on the education field between Ireland and Egypt?
This is something I have particular personal interest in, and I'm happy to say we already have very good cooperation. We have 2 Irish universities which are cooperating very closely with 2 private Egyptian universities in the areas of pharmacy and business. There are other Irish universities very, very interested in developing their links in Egypt, and they are exploring the possibilities. We also have very close cooperation in postgraduate research, particularly in the physics, material science area, and we have very close cooperation also in surprisingly pedagogy. So we have good cooperation between one Irish university and one Egyptian university on developing teaching programs. So it's there, but there is lots and lots of scope to increase the cooperation, and certainly President Sisi's vision for international universities in the new administrative capital is one area where we should cooperate more.
Explore, yes, more.
Yes, we should explore. Yes.
Before we go back to Egypt, we have to talk about your second hat, which is Lebanon, because you're the ambassador, non-resident ambassador to Lebanon, and Lebanon is a very dear country to Egypt with the Lebanese people, and how much Lebanon is part of the heart of Egyptians and vice versa. Egypt is a great part of the hearts of Lebanese. I was following the news and I found out that the President of Ireland had an official visit to Lebanon in the middle of all these crises, and he was, of course, very well much received by the President of the Republic of Lebanon, and you were the one who helped very much in making such a visit successful. Why was that visit important, and what was the aims of this visit?
Well, we have a very long relationship with Lebanon, and indeed, Lebanon, as much as Ireland, has a huge diaspora. And it's something we recognise and we treasure in a way. But in addition to that, we've had a long presence in Lebanon with UNIFIL. Our soldiers have been on the
part of the
southern
United
border
Nations,
of the United Nations forces, and we've been there since 1978. With UNIFIL, but in fact our first overseas deployment of Irish peacekeepers was in 1958 to the United Nations Observer Group, Lebanon.
Yes.
Peacekeeping is something that's very, very important for Irish foreign policy. And our president's visit was in part to visit the troops, but also to cement that relationship we have with Lebanon, which has developed very much because of the presence of UNIFIL, the Irish troops in UNIFIL. When I was growing up, I was nearly as familiar with the names of villages in South Lebanon as I was with the names of villages in Ireland, because we heard them all the time on the radio.
Really?
Yeah, because of at the time the conflict was quite hot, and so
very hot, yes.
you know we used to hear these names about when Irish soldiers had been involved in some conflicts.
And unfortunately, I know that some of them bravely lost their lives and got injured as well to protect the peace and to protect the civil population. Sure. Serving under the Blue Berets is definitely a very distinguished service, which I believe Ireland has taken part and role of it in different countries and different conflicts, not just in Lebanon, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're proud to say that since 1958, there has not been a day that has gone by when an Irish soldier has not been on peacekeeping duty somewhere in the world. Lebanon is our largest deployment at the moment, but we're also in Bosnia, we're also in Kosovo, we're also in Mali, and UNSO,
UNTSO, which is of course the peacekeeping force in Sinai.
Yes.
And you had an important role in 1973 with the disengagement, right?
That's right.
In Sinai.
We did it. Yes, that's true.
Yes.
So it's important, but it's also an area where we cooperate with Egypt, because Egypt is also a major contributor to peacekeeping and peacekeeping forces, particularly in Africa.
Yes.
So, and
we have our own experience as well in Bosnia, of course, and Serbia.
Yes.
During the conflict of the 90s.
Yes.
The Egyptians had a role, comrades in arms, as they say, with the Irish as well.
Yes, indeed.
So this is another branch of cooperation between Egypt and Ireland. So after the break, we'll have some final words about Egyptian-Irish relations.
Okay.
Stay with us, please. So we're still on air with His Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, Ambassador of Ireland in Egypt, and we're having such a nice, decent, friendly talk today, sir. Really, it's a great pleasure and honor. We have talked about Ireland, we have talked about Egypt, and we have talked about Egyptian-Irish relations. We are talking about the future now, the future of our relations. How prosperous will that be future beside the high-tech industry and education? What else fields do you want to invade and to attract the attention of the Egyptians and the Irish too?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm very, very keen to do, overall, I would say, the future of our relationship is very, very bright, and I hope that I can make a small contribution to that in my remaining time in Cairo. But for me, one of the things I'm very, very keen to do, and one of the things which we're doing in the embassy, is trying to expose Egypt to Irish culture in all its dimensions. So one of the things we're doing, in fact, this weekend is we're having a day to celebrate the creativity, innovation, and leadership of women. And this is based on a figure from Irish mythology called Bridget, who was a fertility goddess and then became a saint. But she represents the creativity, innovation, and leadership of women. So we're starting with that this weekend. In the first 6 months of this year, we're also going to be having some theatre performances. We're going to have some musical performances. And we will also be celebrating James Joyce, the non-Nobel Prize winner, in June. And so this is a small section of what we're going to do. But I think one of the better things we can do in Egypt is to talk about Irish culture and how it influences the world and how much we love it.
So of course we have to go back to people's diplomacy.
Yes.
And maintaining a strong relation between people will definitely force the governments to be as close as it might be, right?
Sure.
Sir?
That's part of it, yes, absolutely.
Excellency Ambassador Sean Oregon, thank you very much for such a pleasant interview. We really have valued very much your opinion and your discussions, and we hope that you promise us to come again to our humble program in the near future.
It's been a real pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and very, very happy to come back again.
Thank you, sir. This is World of Info. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. Dua Muhammad was at the control. We're happy to see you next week, same time, same station, FM 95.4 from Radio Cairo. Stay tuned with us with Nadine Amil.